full on slide sharing mode. Okay, I'll ask everyone who's not presenting to mute and turn their video off. All right, welcome to the perception and cognition session for VIS 2024 with a mix of VIS and TVCG papers. And let's just go ahead and start things off. We've got Racquel Fygenson and Padilla doing a paper on impact of vertical scaling on normal probability density functions from the Curry VIS lab at Northeastern. Take it away, Racquel.
Thank you. Sorry for the noise. I'm here in Boston at Boston Viz presenting, and today I'll be talking about my and my advisor, Padilla's work on everyone's favorite graph type, probability density function plots. But in particular, we're going to be talking about normal probability density function plots, or PDF plots, and what happens when we compress those plots. So just to start with, PDF plots are often used to communicate scientific results. These are examples pulled from some papers that we worked on that have been published at VIS. And importantly, we see that PDF plots don't often appear singularly, but rather in series or pairs. And that's because often to interpret these results, we want to compare different plots to one another. Now let's talk about what happens when you or me as a researcher wants to create one of these figures. The first thing that might happen is you're going to go into your stat software, you're going to run your analysis, and you're going to output some PDF plots. And these usually by default occupy an equal pixel area. So the area under each of the curves takes up the same number of pixels. And that's fine and all, but when we have plots with small standard deviations, often they can get high and occlude other plots, and that can lead to a kind of messy looking visualization. So what might we do? Well, we're problem solvers, so we could space things out a little bit, and that looks better, more clean, but as we all know, venues so like TVCG and VIS sometimes have page limits, and this might take up more space than we're willing to sacrifice for a figure. On top of that, there's a lot of white space. Maybe that's not ideal. What else could we do? Well, we all are data visualization experts. One thing we might realize is that PDF plots encode statistical information, including, oh, sorry, this takes up a lot of space. I'm so sorry. That PDF plots encode statistical information including standard deviation with their width and mean with their positioning along the x-axis. So what we can do here is vertically compress some of the plots so they're all equal in height. And this doesn't impact the statistical information underlying our encoding, and it fits, and it kind of looks like the perfect solution. And this is common enough that we have popular stats viz libraries like StanBasePlot and ggdist supporting this type of design decision. And now Lace and I were interested in if this irregular vertical scaling among PDF plots in a series impacts people's comparison of those plots. And we thought it might, and here's why. I'm going to take us all through some logic about how people can compare PDF plots to come to conclusions. So let's step back and decide that we are now marine biologists and we're sampling seawater, and we're interested in the concentration of two different solutes in the seawater, A and B. And in particular, we want to know which solute has a higher probability of being present at 20 parts per million or less. Luckily, we have some PDF functions that describe the probabilities of these solutes appearing, and we can have these PDF functions both appearing as equal area functions, and we can also duplicate them, scale one down, and now we have a statistically identical pair of PDF plots that now are equal height. How are we going to answer this question? Well, first, we'll find 20 on the x-axis. We'll trace it upwards till we hit the top of the curve, and we'll shade in the area under the curve that correlates with 20 parts per million or less. And now if we look at the equal area side, if we want to find which solute has a higher probability, we can simply compare the partial areas under the curve, see that solute A is bigger, and then come to that conclusion. That's our right answer. If we wanted to do the same thing with our equal height PDFs, it's a bit more complicated. If we just compare the two solutes, partial areas under the curve, we'll find that solute B is the right answer, and that will be incorrect. So in fact, we have to go back and actually recognize that now that we've scaled down solute A, we have to look at a proportional area comparison. So we actually have to take the partial area under the curve and see how much of its parent area under the curve it takes up. So we're looking at the light purple in comparison to the amount of the dark navy curve that it takes up. And here we can compare the two and come up with the correct answer that solute A is, in fact, the higher probability of being present at 20 ppm or less. So we just saw that both forms of PDFs work. We can still use them to compare correctly, but one is slightly more complicated than the other. And this made us think that readers might either not know or forget that they need to do this more complicated area comparison, or even if they can, maybe they would struggle with it because this involves more moving parts and some irregular non-polygonal areas. So we wanted to test out if this was the case. We ran an experiment with a sample size of 401 participants. And for each of our participants, we showed them a bunch of different PDF pairs. Some were statistically identical, so they had the same mean and both standard deviations of 5. Some had the same mean, but a standard deviation of 5 was one of the plots, and the other plot had a standard deviation of 4. And we kept on altering our standard deviation pairs. So we had a standard deviation pair of 5 and 3, 5 and 2, and 5 and 1. And we asked participants to compare and find the cumulative probabilities relative in these pairs. We also had some between subject driven visual treatments. So we separated our groups into, we separated our participants into 4 groups. In the first group, we showed plots that had an equal area. The second group saw plots with an equal height. The third group saw plots with an equal height and a y-axis that was scaled accordingly with that lowered height. And the fourth group saw plots with an equal height and standard deviation annotations marking SDs away from the mean. We asked everybody the same question that we all just walked through earlier together about sampled seawater, but we varied the 20 ppm number around, and we looked at different numbers on the x-axis, and we also randomized the ordering of the graph pairs and the graph placement and did some extra retest and test reliability. So people saw like double of each question. And across the board, unless both pairs were statistically identical, the answer was always that the solute with the smaller standard deviation resulted in a higher probability. So here are our results. When we look at SD pairs that are 5 and 5, so these are statistically and visually identical PDFs, we find that accuracy is very, very high all the way. It's hidden for people in my room, but all the way over on the right-hand side, around 90 to 100% for all of our visual interventions. But when we compare SD pairs of 4 and 5, so one plot has a standard deviation of 4, the other one has a standard deviation of 5, our accuracy drops considerably to the 50 to 60% range when those plots are equal area. And if you forget what equal area looks like, that's shown on this left-hand side, that's an inset right there. And when we compare that to equal height plots, which again, we have an inset shown on the left, we can see that the equal height plots comparison accuracy drops a lot down to the 10 to 30% range. When we add in standard deviation annotations to our equal height graphs, it increases accuracy a bit. And when we add in a y-axis to our equal height graph, it also increases accuracy a bit, but nothing to be on par with our equal area plots. Now, if we go through and we look at all of the other standard deviation pairs, we see that accuracy shifts up towards the right a bit, but we maintain kind of this ordering of equal height leading to the worst comparison accuracy and equal area leading to the best comparison accuracy. And we see this pattern continue with standard deviation pairs of 2 versus 5 and a standard deviation pair of 1 versus 5. So the major takeaways from our results are that, so sorry for people in the room who can't see it, but are that as our standard deviation pairs grow in difference, so as the graphs get visually more distinct because their standard deviations are larger from one another, accuracy goes up. And that across the board, equal area plots, which are highlighted out here in this blue circled line, perform with lead to higher accuracy in comparison than equal height plots, which are circled in yellow here. In summary, we have to advise against irregularly compressing plots when you present them all together in a series, and that's just because it increases the probability of incorrect comparisons. Further, we think that this work highlights the complicated nature of irregular or perhaps non-polygonal area judgments and provides a nice foundation for further work in this area. And while we were working on this, Lisa and I were thinking deeply about probability and how it's encoded. And we wanted to point out the fact that we don't often experience probability in the real world as an area or a length or a height. And yet we have a lot of encodings, including PDF plots, that rely on these measurements to communicate probability. And so we wonder about exploring encodings that could afford probability more strongly and how these encodings might act if they would be more robust to small design decisions like compression. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to my team for supporting. The whole lab is great. And if you're interested in our paper, you can check out the full paper.
All right. Thank you very much. We already do have a great question on Slido. For the equal height plots, did you tell the subjects that the two PDFs had the same areas?
So we told all the subjects how to read the plot. So for the equal height plots, we communicated that the area under the curve for both plots should equal 1. So we didn't tell them that they had the same pixel areas because that would be untrue, but we did communicate that mathematically they were communicating they both had the same areas.
Okay, nice. Another one. What sort of visualizations do you think might better support the way that people experience probabilities in the wild?
Oh, I love this question. This is interesting. We have evidence that frequency framing can support better understanding probability, especially textually. And then we have things like hops and QDPs that are starting to perform better than PDFs, which are fun. But there are interesting concepts that hops and QDPs even now don't address, which is this idea that we experience probability. Well, I guess hops addresses it very well, but we experience probability as a series of occurrences over time. And so I think it can be very hard to communicate that correctly without encoding over time. And I think that's why like hops affords probability so well. But Lisa and I are looking into it. So hopefully keep your eyes peeled for some more affordance-based encodings of probability. Yeah.
Nice. Thanks very much. I'll chime in with what Michael Gleitcher said on the Discord, which is I'm amazed that people can do this at all. So am I. It's pretty stunning and interesting. And Alex points out it's nice to sort of go deeper into these statistical representations, Alex Kale. But for now, we will need to move on and have Charles Perin now switch over to sharing his screen. We're going to have two back-to-back Charles talks, and starting with the first on the effect of visual aids on reading numeric data tables. So Charles, please take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. This work is based on the research that Kim, that you can see here, conducted with Miguel and I while he was completing his master's degree in the VIS lab at the University of Victoria. He left academia since, and so I'm presenting on his behalf. Let me start with the kind of the takeaway from this talk. It's that visual aids help read tables, but features and encodings help in different situations. And I'm going to tell you a bit what that means. We use tables that show numbers all the time for analysis, for communication, and we change a lot how they look, thinking it helps us to read them. But the question is, do these visual aids actually help? And so the first thing we did was to clarify what we mean by visual aids for tables. We differentiate what we call visual features, which are design choices that affect the look of a table without visually encoding data values, usually made following some graphic design guidelines, and visual encodings, which, unlike visual features, represent data within the table graphically, so the table length, for example. And so it leverages visualization guidelines. But surprisingly, we don't know if and when those are actually useful. And so to partially answer this question, we designed an experiment in which we tested 4 visual aids for 4 tasks on tables. So let me show you the 4 visual aids first. This is the baseline condition, what we call the plain table. You see one of the stimulus in the experiment. It's a table with 30 animes here in rows and 12 attributes in columns. They're all on a scale from 10 to 100. And this is the same table, but with zebra striping. We are all familiar with. It's a visual feature that's supposed to help follow a row horizontally. Then we have the color visual encoding. The larger a value, the darker its background color. And then the bar visual encoding with the larger the value, the larger the bar in a cell. These are very common encodings that we can see in Microsoft Excel, for example. Okay, so we have these 4 conditions, and we also have 4 tasks. The first one is called find the vertical maximum. The prompt asks to find the column called completed here, which is there, and then to find the maximum value in that column, which is 73, and then to find the corresponding entry, which is magical warfare in that case. The second task is called horizontal maximum. So it's the complement to the first one. It asks, in this example, to find the attribute with the largest value for the anime called first stage, which is in this row, and the largest value is 69 here, which corresponds to that column. And so the answer is the attribute called favorite. Next is the proportional differences task. It's a bit more complicated. It has to compare the values for 2 animes, here, these 2 there, and to compare values in these 2 rows, but only in the last 4 columns. We then find which attribute shows the largest proportional difference between the 2 animes, which is this pair here in the column named completed. So that's the answer. And the last one, it has to find the value, very simple task. Here, find the anime called Ultimate Horror. In this row, and this attribute called watching in this column, and in the value, which is 40. All right, so that's 4 visual aids or conditions and 4 tasks. And we had 24 participants who had normal uncorrected vision participate in a 1-hour-long study in which they perform 4 repetitions for each task with each aid, with an eye tracker, mouse, keyboard, and in front of a 32 inches 4K display. Because we are interested not just in measuring what happens, but also in understanding why things happen, we collected and analyzed a bunch of data sources to answer our research questions. To look at performance, we analyzed task completion time. For that, we used 95% high density intervals of the log and transform mean estimation. We also looked at correctness, but this yielded very few interesting results because trials were completed with very high success rate overall. And also at mouse movement, where we compared trials where participants used the mouse and those where they did not, both in terms of completion time and correctness. So this quantitative analysis part was pre-registered with the Bayesian analysis that came with it, and you can find all those experimental details at that URL there. We also collected perceived performance and preferences for each visual aid and for each task. And to understand the performance results, we coded the participant strategies to complete each task using a combination of eye movement pattern and usage of the mouse. So that's a lot of data. What did we find? I'm going to give only the high-level results, given the time constraints, but I refer you to the paper for more details. First of all, we were wondering which aid would help the most. As I mentioned earlier, our main measure of performance is completion time, so that's what we look at, and differences are already substantial. So here are the results for the vertical maximum task. We rank the conditions according to completion time for those conditions, and we find that in that case, color wins with bar a close second and plain and zebra together, then, with which participants took almost double the time to complete the task. For horizontal maximum, color still helps, but not as much, with a 10% improvement in performance. For proportional differences, which is the most complicated task, as you saw, it's instead zebra that wins with a 5% improvement. And zebra also wins for finding the value with a larger improvement of over 9%. So the question is what is going on here? Well, first, color encoding definitely helps for finding the maximum value either in a row or in a column, which is expected because when looking for the maximum value, color helps focus only on those that are relevant because they're darker. The bar encoding, interestingly, only helps when searching the maximum vertically in column, because like with color, we can focus like only on large bars, but bar doesn't help horizontally. And there are two possible reasons for this. Well, first, in the stimuli, we are scaling the encodings between 0 and the maximum value per column, which makes horizontal comparisons not very meaningful. It's not a global scaling, but it's unlikely to be the reason because it affects the color encoding the same way, which did well. A more likely reason is that comparing bars on unaligned scales is more difficult, as we know from the visualization literature, and Tamara can attest to that. And for two tasks, the ones at the bottom, zebra was the most helpful. And this is something we could expect for finding a value which doesn't require making any kind of comparison. But we are surprised to find that zebra is more helpful for the most complicated tasks that requires making many pairwise comparisons, and where we thought that visual encodings would help more. Why is that? To answer that question, we looked at and analyzed a lot of gaze tracking and mass movement traces. And in short, what we found is that the encodings and above all color help when it saves us from performing some cognitive operations like comparisons, which is the case for these tasks on the top. But zebra helps more when the task is dominated by operations where most of the time is spent performing navigational operations that consist mostly of moving your eyes around, which is the case for these tasks at the bottom. And we're actually quite surprised by how non-trivial the gaze movements are, even for a very simple operation like finding a value given the name of a row and a column, which is something we do all the time with tables. First, you have to find the row, remember where it was, and then find the column, and then you travel down to more or less where you remember where the row was, and then you usually check left and right a couple of times, hoping not to lose the lane, until you're sure you know where you are, and then you can read the value in the cell. We are surprised to find that color and bars don't help with those navigations, even though we initially thought that the different distributions of visual arrangements would create some kind of patterns that could serve as visual landmarks, but it doesn't seem to be the case. The simple zebra pattern seems to be way more useful, and not only for horizontal navigation, which we would expect, but also for vertical navigation, maybe because it's simpler to interpret. All right, before I wrap up, I wanted to mention a few important points looking ahead. So first of all, we only tested 4 tasks, and there are many tasks that people perform on tables. Interestingly, there is no list or taxonomy out there for tables, and we need this to be able to study how visual aids can help for reading tables. One interesting question is, what happens for more compound, higher level tasks? The cognitive processes and strategies are likely broad and diverse, and just looking at completion time is clearly not enough, as we found in our study already. This work also calls for more studies that would look at other visual aids. We use them all the time. Wouldn't it be nice if we knew how and why they are useful? As a final note, just remember the takeaway message, which is that visual aids help read tables, but features and encodings help in different situations. You can find all experimental material, the pre-registration, the data, and the analysis on that at that URL, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Here's a first question. I assume your stimuli were always entirely visible on the screen. How do you imagine your results would change if users had to scroll?
They would be very different. I think it's a completely different situation and stimulus. We removed all kind of interactivity on purpose because we first wanted to try that out. Of course, in real life, tables are larger than what we had. We had stimulus that were kind of roughly the maximum size you can put on a screen. They were still pretty big, but you didn't have to scroll. There was no interaction involved at all. There will be even more navigation, is what I suspect. And so in that case, an aid like Zebra might be even more useful. It's possible. I don't know. It's really a guess.
Right. Also, did you consider a vertical zebra encoding where you'd stripe the columns? What do you speculate might happen there?
Yeah, we considered probably like 20 different kinds of aids or encodings that we could study. It's one of these studies where we really wanted to have the eye tracking data. And so we had to really kind of trim down the number of options that we could use. And so we use this one because it's the most commonly used, basically. Like by default, if you know in Excel, that's the kind of zebra that you create. And we have this in the tables we use. This kind of, you have the items in rows, and then you have the dimensions in columns. So you tend to lose to follow an item. It's kind of maybe the most standard use of the zebra. We considered adding also the vertical zebra. We just didn't because we couldn't add another condition without having a 2-hour study.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. Some more questions on Slido that you can answer later on Discord, but I don't want to steal time from the next speaker, who is you. And I'm going to ask you to now move on to your second paper on quantifying emotional responses. So please continue on.
All right. The slide deck change worked well, I assume? Yes? Okay.
Yep, great.
So I want to stress that although I'm presenting the work today, the first two authors of that paper really conducted the research, and in particular Carter. He completed this work when he was just an undergraduate student with me in the VIS lab. Since then, he moved to continue his grad studies at the University of Waterloo, and he's right now on a plane, which is why I'm presenting this one. All right, so this title is a bit of a mouthful, Quantifying Emotional Responses to Immutable Data Characteristics and Designer Choices in Data Visualizations. What does that really mean? I'll try to unpack that a bit. So here is a line chart, and I'd just like you to take a second to ask yourself, when you look at this visualization, what do you feel? And what about this one? Although these charts don't have any meaning, we might have an emotional response to the purely visual stimulus. For example, this chart might make you feel a bit sad. It's going downward. While this one might make you feel happy, nice colors going up. Although these two charts have absolutely no meaning, because we don't even know what they're about, there is no data, we do have emotional responses even to a purely visual stimulus. And that's what we look into in this research. Emotion plays a critical role in how people interact with data visualizations. We know that. So prior research tells us that emotions can influence a viewer's trust in the data, how well they retain the information, and also how engaged they are with the visualization. So for example, imagine in healthcare, you might want to trigger a calm emotional response when you convey complex medical information. Or a data journalist might want to provoke a strong emotional engagement with a topic like gun control. And this leads to our key question that we are trying to answer here. As visualization designers, there are some design choices that we can make, but there are also immutable data characteristics that we don't have control over, like the data distribution or the trend. So how do immutable data characteristics interact with visualization design choices when we want to affect emotion? To explore this effect, we conducted 5 crowdsourced studies, each isolating specific variables. And these studies looked at variations of color, at different data trends, various chart types, at different values for data variance, and at different values for data density. We used the self-assessment mannequin scale, which is a well-validated measure for capturing those emotional dimensions. Arousal in pink measures excitement, while valence in blue measures positive and negative emotions. We use the Prolific platform to administer each study to 50 participants within subject design. And for all studies, participants started by providing consent, reading instructions for the study. Then they rated either the arousal or the valence of each condition. Then they did the same for either arousal or valence, depending on their assigned order. And they repeated this 3 times, with the exception of one of the studies where there were only 2 repetitions for time constraints. Finally, they answered some open-ended questions before completing the study. Here is an example of a stimulus from the study that shows the prompt at the top, the visualization in the center, the mannequin scale for the current measurement, which is valence here, and a slider aligned with the scale for participants to input their perceived valence. In our first study, we looked only at color palettes that had been developed in previous work by Bartram and colleagues. We analyzed perceived arousal and valence using Bootstrap 95% confidence intervals, which we use for all our analysis. We show deviation here from the central value of the 9-point arousal and valence scales. And we did find differences between palettes, both in terms of arousal and in terms of valence. And we were further able to find palettes that consistently fell into 3 of the 4 quadrants that are defined by this 2D arousal valence space. However, we didn't find a palette that was highly arousing and that also had low valence. In terms of trend in the data, we found that positive data trends had higher valence and arousal than neutral trends, which in turn had higher valence and arousal than negative trends. While we had hypothesized this relationship between valence and trend, the relationship between arousal and trend came at a surprise. We were expecting neutral trends to be the least arousing, but empirically this wasn't confirmed. In terms of data variance, we also found that as variance increases, arousal increases, and as variance increases, valence decreases. This could be due to the fact that higher variance is associated with uncertainty, which has been found in the past to induce anxiety. And results are similar for data density. As density increases, arousal increases, and as density increases, valence decreases in scatter plots and in line charts. Talking about types of charts, previous work has found evidence for a within the bar bias that tells us that people underestimate the trend of data when it's visualized with an asymmetric chart type, like an area chart or a bar chart. And so in line with this, we found that the difference in perceived valence between positive and neutral trends was significantly higher for symmetric charts, like line chart and scatter plot, than for bar charts, which are asymmetrical. So this suggests that the perceived trend is what influences emotion. We also found that line charts are more arousing than scatter plots, which in turn are more arousing than bar charts. And we also found some evidence suggesting that smoothing line charts can increase their valence. And this is in line with the famous Kiki-Bouba effect from psychology that suggests that round stimuli are more pleasant than sharp stimuli. All right, that's a lot of effects and comparisons, but how do these effects compare to each other? Let's say we want to compare the effect of trend and the effect of color on arousal. What we did is for each participant, let's say P1 here, we calculated the standard deviation of their average arousal rating for trend, and we did the same for color. And then we could compare the effect of trend on arousal with the effect of color on arousal. And what we found is that color had a stronger effect on emotion than trend, which had a stronger effect than chart type. Which brings us to our design recommendations. What can we do as visualization designers when we know immutable data characteristics do affect emotion, even with no semantic meaning? If possible, space data out to increase valence and reduce arousal. You can increase the range of y-axis to increase valence and reduce arousal. You can also smoothen jagged line charts to increase valence. And you can alter the range or the scale that you use to alter the perceived trend and therefore the induced emotion. And finally, use color last to counteract or reinforce the emotion induced by other factors because it is by far the most impactful. However, some of these interventions, they likely affect perceptual accuracy, which is a maybe orthogonal dimension to emotion here that we absolutely didn't look at, right? There was no value retrieval or estimation task that we tested for. So future work should really look into the trade-off between emotional manipulation and perceptual accuracy. All right, I'm putting on that last slide a chart that should make you happy. And so I'm expecting only very nice questions.
All right. We've got one. To what extent can we apply these learnings in designing visualization without compromising data facts?
I think that's the key message from that slide here is that you can use all of these things, but if you go crazy, your chart will probably be pretty useless. We don't really know the extent to which this can affect, like, because, for example, just smoothing a line chart can affect how people will perceive the actual values and therefore the facts. I think what could be done is pick one of these, like we have 5 factors here that we can play with, and conduct some kind of like basic studies about retrieving information from data and seeing at which point these variations like stop making sense or alter the facts in the data. There is a lot around, like, lying or not telling the truth. It's really not what this paper is about. It's trying to uncover this fact that even when you don't have data shown or no title or no message, no label, nothing, you already have an emotional response.
So let me ask you a harder question. Do you think it's appropriate to generalize from one study to full-on design guidelines? To what extent do you think this is a robust finding that would work across all kinds of chart types and contexts?
Okay, maybe design guidelines is not the right word. Maybe it's more like tools or tricks you can use if you want to. So if you know, for example, that some of the data characteristics in your data set are likely to induce a negative emotion, and you want it to be neutral because you don't want to convey that by default, then here are the tools you can try to use to counterbalance that. For what we've tested, it did work for the different chart types we tested, etc. We didn't test all chart types again, right? It's like, although we had 5 studies, we could have conducted probably 50, which we did not. But there is still a lot before we can fully generalize. Yes, I agree. I think it's more like tools you can think about using.
Okay, thank you so much. And with that, let's now move on to our next speaker. So I'm going to ask Helia to go ahead and share her slides. And this is another doubleheader. Both of these are from the Padilla lab. And I see we now have the slides up. So Helia Hosseinpour, please take it away.
Can you hear?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Helia Hosseinpour, and today I will be presenting our... Oh, I think my page just went out. Just a moment. Can you still see it?
Yes, we can still see it.
Okay, great. So today I will be presenting our recent research on examining the limits of small multiples, focusing on how frame quantity impacts human judgment with line graphs. Imagine you're an energy grid operator monitoring dozens of small multiple frames, displaying real-time power output across different regions. You only have seconds to spot potential issues, but as the number of frames on your screen increases, so does the challenge of making accurate decisions. This is the reality in many real-world applications where small multiples are used to show vast amount of data. And these are the examples. While prior work highlight how useful they can be, there is no guidance about the ideal number of frames to use. So we get situations like this and this, where increasing the number of frames can be challenging to the human visual system, potentially leading to errors, misinterpretations, or oversight. To provide guidance about the number of frames for a given task, this work explores how human performance changes as frame quantities increase. We investigate the relationship between number of frames and task performance with small multiples using two competing cognitive theories. They include cognitive capacity limits and visual search capabilities. Cognitive capacity limits suggest that there is a threshold beyond which people cannot hold more information mentally, leading to a decline in performance and a dramatic drop. Visual search capabilities refer to the ability of the visual system to recognize patterns and identify task-relevant items within an array, leading to a decline in performance in a linear fashion with increasing frame quantities. To investigate the limits of small multiples, we conducted two online studies with 141 and 360 participants respectively, and a follow-up eye tracking study with 5 participants. We tested a large number of stimuli in experiment 1 by varying the number of small multiple frames from 2 to 70, increasing by 4 frames, incrementing by 4 frames. So this means, for example, here we have one with 2 frames, we add 4, we get 6 frames, we add 4 again, we get 10 frames, and we keep adding 4 frames until we get to 62 frames, and then 66 frames, and finally 70 frames. And participants completed 7 different tasks with these small multiples categorized into 3 types. And those include identify, compare, and summarize. So all participants did these tasks, and in identify tasks, participants had to find specific frames, like ones when the trend line has the highest peak or crosses a threshold. In compare tasks, participants were shown 2 highlighted frames, and they had to compare between them. And finally, in the summarize tasks, participants were asked to determine overall trends or provide an average power across all frames. And for example, this is the way they might do that. They might also look at the y-axis for the numbers.
Helia, let me briefly interrupt. It seems that the left side of your screen is being a bit cut off. Is there something going on where we could get the full screen being shown? I wonder if you've got some sort of a zoom happening. There. Great.
Is it good now? Or was it cut
it's
off?
perfect. Thanks so much. Keep going now.
Okay. Well, I'm glad it's working now. All right.
Yep.
Well, then in experiment 2, we introduced controls for frame scale, which is shown here, and also time constraints. And finally, in our eye tracking portion, we compared participants' eye movement pattern and fixations across the tasks. Our core finding was that accuracy declined linearly as number of frames increased across all tasks. For instance, for a task like Identify 1 here, finding the highest peak power with only 2 frames was easier to spot. But as we added more frames up to 70, the task became much harder and participant accuracy dropped. And this linear decline reflects how difficult it becomes to maintain performance when the number of frames grow, supporting the visual search theory. In the compare text, when only 2 frames were highlighted, the accuracy decline was less steep compared to their identified task counterparts in blue. And so while highlighting the specific frames to do the same task did help reduce the visual search burden, it did not eliminate it. So even with highlighted frames, participants still had to process them within the larger context of 70 frames. In experiment 2, we wanted to see if this decline in accuracy was due to possible time limits or the shrinking size of the frames as more were added. We found that for time limits, accuracy was significantly lower, where participants had only 40 seconds to complete the Identify 1 and Identify 3 tasks. And those were the tasks where required participants to either find the highest peak or locate where the trend line crossed a threshold. And that is in comparison to having an unlimited amount of time to conduct the task. For frame size or frame scale, again, in tasks like Identify 3, where participants had to spot where the trend line crossed a threshold, smaller frame sizes resulted in lower accuracy compared to full-scale larger frames. And here we can see that participants struggled more with smaller frames because the visual details were harder to discern. Our eye tracking study further provided insight into why participants might struggle. So here we have heat maps of some of our visualizations. And in the one with fewer frames, there are more concentrated areas of focus, those dark orange portions. But as frame quantities increased, the scan patterns became more scattered, indicating that participants had to search more broadly, which reduced accuracy. In contrast, the compare task with highlighted frames showed more focused gaze patterns on those specific portions, reinforcing the idea that visual search can be an important challenge in large arrays of frames. So this finding emphasized the need for designers of small multiples in critical environments like energy grid control rooms to incorporate features that minimize visual search burden. Techniques such as zooming, panning, filtering, and interactive piling can help users maintain accuracy and explore frames more selectively by dynamically updating the display to focus on selected frames. In conclusion, small multiples are effective tools, but their effectiveness decreases as frame quantities increase. By addressing the visual search challenge, we can enhance their usability in high-stake situations where fast and accurate decisions are essential. With that, I'd like to thank my wonderful co-authors, and you can find the preprint, data analysis, and pre-registration of our study on the Open Science Framework. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. I really appreciated that you mixed methods where you had the 2 pre-registered quant studies and then this exploratory study afterwards with the eye tracking data. I'm curious, did you decide to do that exploratory study only after fully analyzing the 2 pre-registered ones? Or did you sort of find yourself thinking along the way much earlier that maybe you'd end up needing to do this to try to clarify things like strategies?
Yeah, the eye tracking portion was done prior to analyzing the first 2 studies fully. Based on preliminary data that we were looking at and the second experiment that we did, we thought it might be important to do a scan pattern analysis, fixation analysis particularly, to see if what we are possibly imagining what might participants be going through with the visual search is actually what's happening as they look through the graphs among the different tasks.
Great, thanks. Another question from Slido. Does ordering affect the results in a comparison task?
Ordering effects?
Yeah, does ordering affect the results in a task on comparison?
We did check for order effects. We didn't find anything, but for tasks like specifically the compare task, I think they're asking, we did not look specifically at that task, but this was all a within participant design where participants, for example, for experiment 1 would see all the visualizations for one task and then the next task and then the next task. The tasks were between subjects. And there was no order effects.
Right, but I wonder if they mean order with how the participants saw stimuli, or do they mean order of the frames within the larger visualization? I actually don't know which one they mean.
Interesting. Well, order of the frames. Okay, so for the compare task, something that we did do to control is that, and I'll show you the example again. This distance between the 2 comparisons, that was the same for every single visualization, in case that's what the question is. So these 2 might be at different locations, but their distance at least was controlled.
Okay, Thanks very much. Some more quick questions on Slido that are going to get transferred into Discord for continued discussion. There's already a lot going on in Discord with discussing previous papers. So much to do there, but let us move on to our next. And I'm going to ask Christophe Hurter to start sharing his screen as we work towards memory recall for data visualizations in mixed virtual 3D and 2D.
Thank you.
All right, Christophe, please take it away.
Yes, so let's see if you can see everything and hear me. So thanks a lot for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. So this paper is a TVCG paper, and to be honest, it has been done during the COVID pandemic, and it took us a while to shape the paper, and then we have now very interesting results where we compare different modalities in the virtual reality and mixed reality with something called Memory Palace. So it's not in the title, but I will get through that. So I'm sure most of you know about this Memory Palace method of loci, and which is a method that helps to remember a lot of things, where you anchor items with a geographical location. So basically, such method is used for games, and also there's been the championships recently that have been promoted, and we had the opportunity to see these people able to remember more than 300 words in let's say 10 or 15 minutes, which is really impressive. And the way to do that is that you need to focus and you think about the path that you know very well, and along this path you anchor some items, and then it helps you to memorize this, and at the same time you memorize the path that you already know. So this is a very well-known technique to anchor information, and it has been previously investigated with a VR headset with Kokos and his colleague, and where they had this experimentation with the face recognition and the face memorization using the VR headset, where the user was sitting wearing the headset and try to remember as many faces as possible. But as you can see, all the faces are well-known celebrities, which makes the thing easier. So for us, when we read this paper, we said, well, is there anything that have been done with data visualization? And in fact, nothing was yet provided. So this is an incentive and a motivation to build a paper around this memory palace paradigm and the data visualization. So how we designed this experimentation was a bit difficult, because we had to find a way to maximize the chance also to do the memorization, and that fits well with the memory palace paradigm. So for that, we use a very specific type of visualization, which is this isotype, or this international system of typography, pictures, education, that has been introduced by Otto and Maria Neurath and the designer Gerd Hans. And so for the one who are not familiar with this, isotypes is a way that you encode with icons some values. So on the left, you have the bar chart. On the right, you have the isotype representation of this bar chart. And for us, this type of visualization is perfect for the memorization in the memory palace environment, because the icons is something that you know, and it will help the way you can anchor these items in a given location. So to build this experimentation, we first started to build the dataset and the visualization. And for that, we need to remove any confounding factors. So we had to build 4 sets of 10 representation. And for that, it took us a lot of time to find data that are possibly comparable. And so nothing that going to one extreme in terms of the semantic of the data that has to be represented, but also nothing that is too complex in terms of data analysis that could be done with the data, because the user is going to remember all of this. So we want to have a fair comparison. So you have on the bottom left the type of visualization we built, and on the right all the criteria we applied so that our sets of data set are comparable. And we end up with this. What we've done in this experimentation, you will see more detail in the paper and later on the presentation, but the user will see 10 representation, 10 data. And this is the type of representation they are going to watch. You see that they look quite similar, but they have all the different semantic. Some are about cats, some are about a child, some about money and things like that. All the data has been extracted from open source award in data.org. What is important is the rooms we are going to investigate. To remove any confounding factors, and this is a novelty in this experimentation, is that we use physical rooms, but also the digital version of the room, because we are going to compare mixed reality and virtual reality. And for that, we need to anchor visualization with something similar. So what we did is that we use a SLAM and the LiDAR techniques for the one who are used to, where we scan the room, and so that we have the so-called digital twin of the room available. So for this experimentation, we have 3 rooms, and it was really fun because it was during the pandemic. So we had 1 room in Belgium and 2 in France. So the rooms are somehow similar in terms of size, but also in terms of content, in terms of features that could help about the way to anchor and to remember items in the rooms. So the modalities are already touched base a little bit on this. So we have 4 modalities. So one is a standard modality where we're going to present each of the 10 set of images to the user, where the user will have to remember as much as possible information from this. We have the 3D modality, where the user will navigate in the 3D environment with the screen. The next one is a virtual reality with a headset and a fully immersive headset. And the last one is a mixed reality, where the user is going to navigate in the room physically. So compared to the state of the art, what we have, so we study 3D versus virtual reality, as Krokos and Al and colleagues did, but we also added the 2D condition, images by images, and also the mixed reality. We also add this notion of memory palace using data visualization, and our task involved the memory, the object recalls, but some additional items that have been somehow explored, but nothing with data visualization, with the spatial location, with the semantic features and the synthetic feature, the shape of the visualization. Okay, so I know it's a lot of information, so let's have a look at the video that will explain and show you concretely how the experimentation was conducted. So this is a 2D condition. So the user faces the screen and can scroll one by one between the 10 visualization the user has to remember. In the 3D setting, the user faces the screen and can navigate with the keyboard into this virtual room, which is a copy of the physical room. And you can see the visualization are encoded on the wall of the visualization. In the virtual reality, we use the same setting as Krokos and Hal, which is the user sits, has a VR headset, and can navigate with the wand. And the speed of the navigation is the same in each modality. It mimics the walking speed. And the mixed reality, the user will navigate this time physically in the environment and using the HoloLens too, and where the holograms are encoded and at the same position, by the way, than in virtual reality environment. So for this experimentation, in each condition, the user will spend 5 minutes in the rooms, could be physically, virtually, in 2D or in 3D, and try to remember as much as possible information. So let me get through some details about the process. We have 16 observers. Of course, all the conditions have been balanced and organized. After the experimentation, we ask the user to retrieve everything that have been remembered. So we categorized everything that had been remembered with this. The topic, which is the semantic about the visualization. The shape is about, is the data descending, ascending, is there a peak, is that flat? Details could be any value that the user can remember. And the order is where the visualization were placed on the wall or the order in the 2D visualization. Okay, I'm getting late. So here is the result we have, and all the details in the paper. But what you can see is that whatever the condition, whatever the type of memorization we look at, the mixed reality was always better than the three others condition. We can see that the 2D condition, the one where you have images one after another one, is not bad. And it's normal because this is something that we're really used to as a way to remember information. But what was surprising is that mixed reality really does a really good job compared to the VR. So we have all the detail in the paper trying to compare why the mixed reality has such great assets. And the main difference is this notion of a kinetic motion, which means that in mixed reality, of course, the user has to move by itself and by himself. And so we cannot prove it, but we have strong evidences that this is the reason why mixed reality in that case is really. So as a conclusion, you get it. This notion of memory palace and the way you can remember works also with data visualization, which is really great. And we have strong assumption that this is linked to this spatial memory and possibly to the kinetic motion, the way that the user moves in his environment. And we know that this is a really great potential for education purposes. So I will stop here. And I would be happy to answer questions.
All right, there's one from Slido. Were participants instructed on the memory palace method before performing the task?
Exactly. Yeah. We did that. We expressed this technique to ask them if they knew about it, and most of them knew about it because at that time it's true that was quite popular. I don't know why. There was maybe some social media events, and we had all this sequence of instructions where everyone had the same. And it's true that there could be a tiny bias for someone that already know very well and use this technique, but none of them were said to us that this is something they regularly use. So there's no bias in that sense, but they know all were knowledgeable about the technique. Yeah, of course, it's very important because otherwise there will be someone. This technique, as you may know, is super strong, so that someone that apply it will remember everything, for sure.
Right. Okay, there's some other questions on the Discord, but we will go ahead and move on to make time for our last presentation. So let me ask Arvind and Johannes to share their screen now for a final talk on attention-aware visualization. And they will be co-presenting from the same physical memory palace space of a shared office. And please take it away, Arvind and Johannes.
Hello, I'm Arvind.
And I'm Johannes, and we're from Aarhus University.
We present our work titled Attention-Aware Visualization, which proposes tracking, recording, and revisualizing a user's attention on a visualization to aid them in understanding what they have seen and what they have not seen. Imagine if every time you stare at a visualization, it responded, highlighting where you're focused and revealing any crucial details you may have missed, guiding you through the data. How can we create a visualization that adapts to you in this way without becoming overwhelming? This is exactly the question that we tried to answer together with our colleagues from Bangor University. Most interactive visualizations rely on explicit inputs like clicking or typing to adapt. By incorporating implicit inputs such as gaze or other physiological signals, visualizations can become more personalized and adaptive in real time, responding to user behavior without manual interaction. This shift can bring about a more intuitive, dynamic experience where the system highlights relevant data based on user focus, enhancing engagement and comprehension while reducing the cognitive load. While context-aware systems have long adapted to users' environments, most visualizations do not do this. Although perceptual theories of attention and advances in eye tracking research have improved our understanding of user focus, visualizations also they rarely take advantage of this. So this is where our concept of attention-aware visualizations, or AAVs, come in. So AAVs are designed to respond to your attention, whether through gaze tracking, head orientation, or mouse movement. By understanding what captures your interest, they can adapt their visual attributes in real time, helping you navigate complex datasets intuitively and effectively. The three key steps of how an AAV works is first, it captures the attention of the user. Then it records this captured attention over time so that using this information, we can then model how different parts of the visualization slip in and out of a viewer's memory. Then this recorded attention over time is also used to modify the visualization in some way based on the this recorded attention. So we call this revisualization. We have explored two different implementations, one that is data aware in 3D, another that is data agnostic in 2D. Data agnostic means the system does not need to understand the underlying data or the layout of the visualization. Instead, the visualization is treated like a black box that focuses solely on where the attention is directed, allowing us to generalize this approach across several different types of visualizations. For this implementation, we use gaze data from an eye tracker. The visualization is divided into small bins, each cumulatively accumulating an attention value based on how long the user's gaze lingers related to the entire visualization. We explored three revisualization techniques as shown here, which is heat map, the counterpart, and mesh. To help viewers understand the engagement in this 2D implementation, we used the picture framing metaphor. With this metaphor, we envisioned visualizations as an artwork with overlays that act like a glaze to highlight regions of interest, or as with minimaps to provide a broader perspective, like decorative elements that help orient the viewer, and even borders that direct attention to key areas like a frame around the picture. A combination of overlays, borders, and minimaps with the revisualization techniques were used, and these were then working together with different triggering mechanisms to help users intuitively understand which areas they have engaged with and what they have missed. And as you can see, these are just three possible combinations of these elements. For example, the first one, in the first one, you can see that there's an area frame that is mixed with the contour plot that is explicitly triggered using a button press. And in the second image, we can see an implicit mesh where you have this changing, varying bar chart that keeps on changing as the attention keeps on changing on this visualization. In a similar case, you also have an always-on heat map where you have this heat map gradation across the frames, and also in the mini map that shows where the attention has been gathered. So using this, we can help the users make sense of where they have looked at and where they haven't looked at, so that they can they can look at different things. So let's move on to 3D implementation. Shall we?
So our 3D implementation is data aware, which means it has knowledge of the underlying data as well as the visualization. This allows the system to react based on the user's attention on the visualization itself. Our 3D implementation is built using Three.js and uses GPU color picking to determine which elements the user is focusing on. And on the right, you can see an example of this. Every face of every geometry has a unique color in the picking scene, and this allows us to determine both which mark and which side of a mark is currently being looked at. For this implementation, we used a MetaQuest 3 to capture head orientation, which then acts as a proxy for user attention in an immersive environment, because the Quest 3 does not have any eye tracking. Because we know the underlying data as well as the visualization, we can then directly modify the visual attributes, such as color, in the visualization to guide user exploration effectively. And we have a few examples here as well. Here we can explicitly highlight how much the user has been looking at different elements. So you can see it turns more red when they look more at this bar chart. And in the second example, we can also choose to de-emphasize elements the user has looked at a lot, turning this darker shade, and then highlight or emphasize elements that they have not looked at a lot. In this case, these scatter dots turn a bright yellow. And finally, we can also just constantly show the user where they're currently looking and where they have looked more than other places. So in this surface plot, the more you look at a certain area, the more red it becomes, showing you where you have looked at a lot and where you have looked at less. With these implementations, we asked ourselves, when should we adapt these visualizations in order to not overwhelm the user? And we came up with 3 mechanisms, and we've already mentioned them. First is an always-on triggering mechanism where we just constantly show the revisualization in some way. Next is an explicit triggering where the user has to press a button or something similar in order to show the revisualization. And finally, an implicit triggering where we use a decaying model of the user's attention to determine when we need to trigger the revisualization. And this decaying model is, as you look at an element, be that a binned part of a data agnostic system or a specific mark, it increases attention at a certain rate. And when you look away, it then decreases attention for that specific element. We conducted 2 user studies, one for each implementation. We hired 12 participants and asked them to engage with 3 different visualizations. And for both evaluations, we used 3 different triggering mechanisms and 3 different revisualizations, all in a counterbalanced manner. Participants provided us with qualitative feedback through a questionnaire and a short semi-structured interview. The results showed mixed but insightful feedback. The explicit triggering was generally preferred by participants as it gave them more control over when this revisualization would show up, while the implicit triggers were generally reported as distracting or confusing with a few positive remarks. The immersive 3D setup was particularly effective in engaging users who described it as fun and like a game. So, having to go around and make sure you've seen everything and turn everything red. So it might be a good way to enhance user engagement. So what did we learn? Attention-aware visualizations have potential to make data exploration more personalized. However, fine-tuning these interactions and especially deciding when and how to trigger changes needs more work. AIVs are not without its limitations. We have already observed that they can reinforce behavior, especially with the always-on triggering. And given the small scale of our study, generalizing our findings may be difficult. We do believe that AIVs are a step towards making data visualization smarter and more contextually aware. However, balance is key. Users want both autonomy and support, and finding the right mix will be our challenge moving forward. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much. So a question from Slido. Great findings. Under which types of circumstances would you envision getting to know how long users looking at specific parts might actually be beneficial?
I maybe like just knowing how long you've looked is not interesting on its own, but in relation to other parts of the visualization, it might be interesting that, oh, has only been looked a lot at this small specific part of a visualization, while this other part has been ignored. And it might also be useful for evaluating a visualization if it is effective in sort of conveying the information, or if people only look at a small part of the visualization and don't look at the entire thing.
We also kind of believe that this can be very useful in collaborative settings, especially in immersive environments where you have a lot of people interacting, and they might be in asynchronous or synchronous in any kind of environments so that when they interact, it'll be really interesting to have the shared awareness which this AVs could provide. So that is something it's also we are interested in exploring.
Thanks. Another question from Danielle Safir. Different tasks might require different kinds of attentional deployment, like searching versus comparison. Would these visualizations generalize across tasks?
I guess I mean the specific revisualizations, not necessarily. The tasks they were asked to do was quite exploratory, sort of searching around for some information that was not was not sort of a one-off reading a value task. But for other tasks, I would envision that it would be other types of revisualizations would be more appropriate.
Okay. One question I had was, I can imagine using this in the context where you want to help people find what they haven't found yet. So if you sort of invert your task, I speculate that you'd need a completely different visual encoding because I think the current one just wouldn't work at all. Have you thought about how to show where to look next, what's missing kinds of highlighting?
Yeah, this is interesting because I mean, we didn't think about it, but we haven't we didn't explore this in this particular paper, but we did really feel like that would be an interesting direction to explore.
We had this sort of emphasizing the points that had low attention values, which is sort of similar, but it doesn't really right now it doesn't consider if you've already looked at it before and then you just looked away for a long time. The problem is also maybe this sort of revisualization could be really helpful if you know the task. But if we already know the task, there might be other more effective ways of helping people accomplish their goals. And if it's an open exploration, then knowing the task is very difficult.
Okay, thank you so much. And with that, I would like to wrap up our session. I particularly want to thank all of the presenters and all of the authors, and also thank folks for really caring about open science. I noticed that a solid 50% of the papers in this session were pre-registered. There's a whole lot that have supplemental materials that will allow people to reuse their work in various different ways in the future. And also we had 6 really great talks, and I hope everyone will run out and read those papers. And I also point you to the really nice and vibrant discussion on Discord of a lot of these ideas. So thank you all for a great virtual Viz session.